Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Season 3 of Ask 5. I'm your host, Monica Molinaro. In this season, you might notice a couple of times where I'm not present for the interviews. Instead, my colleague and co-executive producer of the podcast, Professor Meredith Young, stepped in for me. So just be aware that sometimes you might see a different person or hear a different voice. It's just Meredith stepping in for me for one of the interviews. Today, I am joined by Maia. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Monica.
I'm so glad to have you here. Do you mind introducing yourself to everybody?
Certainly. My name is Maia Siedlikowski. I am a pediatric intensive care nurse at the Montreal Children's Hospital and a PhD student at the Institute for Health Sciences Education here at McGill.
Awesome. Do you mind introducing the question that our 5 had to answer for this episode?
Not at all. So the question today is, in your opinion, which is better, a narrow versus a broad program of research?
Perfect. Let's see what our 5 had to say. Today I'm joined by
Robert Sternszus, Associate Professor of Pediatrics and Health Sciences Education, and Wendy McDonald Chair in Pediatric Medical Education at McGill.
Jacqueline Torti. So I am an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine and a scientist at CERI, the Center for Education, Research, and Innovation. And those are both part of the Schulich School of Medicine and Dentistry at Western University.
Saini, and I am presently enjoying being the president of McGill University, president and Vice-Chancellor. And I'm also a professor in the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences.
So I'm Linda Snell. I am a clinician educator. My clinical work, I'm a general internist. I work at McGill, at the McGill University Health Center. The educator side, I am a core faculty member at the Institute of Health Sciences Education at McGill. And I'm also senior clinician educator at the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada.
Lara Varpio. I'm a professor of medicine at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania and the co-director of medical education research at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia.
In your opinion, which is better, a single research theme or a broad program of research when you're starting out?
I actually don't think there's an absolute right answer to that question. I think ultimately, if what you're aiming for is to become known for something, to become invited to conferences, to be a keynote speaker, to be invited to write a book chapter, to eventually get promoted through the academic ranks, I think having a program of research, having a lane, something that you're recognized for is important. But I don't necessarily think that everybody starts there or that it's even reasonable to expect people to start there. And so for me, I started by dabbling. I did some role modeling, some professionalism, some curiosity, some program evaluation, and over 5 to 8 years sort of found a lane and now live in that lane. But I don't think very many people come into their careers knowing exactly what their lane is. And I think it's totally reasonable and probably even desirable to play in a few sandboxes and find your lane over time. With an eye towards, I think, eventually trying to figure out what it is that you want to sort of be known for or what space you want to live in. And then I would also say that even once you're living in that space, it's also fun and okay to dabble in other spaces. So yes, there's this, for me, it's professional identity formation. That's my lane. That's what I'm known for. But every now and then a really interesting project comes along or I'm asked to be a part of something or to supervise a student that's in a completely different area. And it's really fun to go and play there too.
I have given this question a lot of reflection and thought in the past couple of years. So to contextualize it, I just started my position as a faculty member in 2022. And leading up to that, I had spent some time between my PhD and that faculty position as a research associate, really trying to build up my CV. And so it came down to trying to figure out how to craft that narrative between the work that you've done and the work that you want to do in the future and what that might look like. I think ideally, if you've had the privilege of having, a graduate training where you continue your theme or program of research from your master's through to your PhD and even your postdoc, If you have had the privilege of maybe even staying in the same discipline or the same context methodology throughout, you have a really nice kind of self-crafted narrative of how your program of research is connected and how things work. But not everyone has that linear kind of experience to their role. And so that was much the case for me. I did my PhD in public health sciences, and my PhD was actually on the mental health of vegetarians, which is related in some ways, but very much different from the work that I'm doing now as a health professions education scholar, and my focus is on character-based leadership. And so I had to figure out, how do I end up crafting a narrative from the work that I've done during my graduate training to where I wanted my program of research to go. And then in between, as I mentioned, not all of us have the great privilege of getting a faculty job right off the bat, and more we're either doing postdocs or working in between. And so as a research associate, I spent a lot of time supporting other faculty members in their programs of research. And so it became kind of a selective narrative of trying to find a bit of a theme or a thread to your program of research and how those types of things are connected. And it takes a lot of thought and reflection to figure that out. Sometimes it's really self-evident. Other times people may point it out to you that this is kind of the thread or the theme between things. So I would say that's one thing, is it's about taking the time to reflect and craft the narrative. And if you've got a great, kind of linear path and a strong program of research ahead of you with a clear theme, that's great. But if you don't, there's always ways to kind of shape that narrative or that story of how that program of research came to be.
So for you, that question, it sounds like it holds a false dichotomy. It's not necessarily a full program or a focused program of research or broad interests. It's really about how you shape the narrative.
I think so, because everyone can kind of approach it in their own unique way. I think there's strengths and benefits to both. I think if you were to have, a really solidified program of research, you can really, get into that depth of the knowledge base and expertise in that area, really craft yourself as an expert or scholar in that area and start to form your scholarly identity around that, which is great. But at the same time, for hiring committees, often when there's a call for a tenure track or even an open faculty position, there's a specific subject or context to that call. Mm-hmm. They're looking for a particular niche for someone to fill. And so if you've just got one direct route with not a lot of kind of branching out and expanding on that theme, sometimes it might be really hard to craft the narrative towards this is how I fill that niche. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have a bit more breadth about you, but you're still able to draw and connect some pieces there, you might more easily be able to craft that narrative to talk about how your research might overlap or fit that particular niche.
So you've used the word narrative a lot, and I like it. If someone's trying to kind of look at the dots on their CV or their kind of the way that they've spoken about their research before and trying to think about how to craft either an overall narrative or something that pulls something together, what were some techniques or strategies that worked for you when you were trying to do it?
Yeah, so I spoke to a lot of mentors about this, about how you go about doing it. There's books, there's tutorials, there's workshops on crafting your program of research and what that could look like. And originally I thought maybe it was methodological. And that's one of the tips I got from a qualitative mentor of mine, is that sometimes the niche might not necessarily be content or topic expertise, but maybe it's a methodological expertise. So maybe you hone in on narrative inquiry. And that's your program of research and your thread. So you use narrative inquiry, but you use it in multiple ways to explore different disciplines and different contexts. And sometimes, it's thinking a bit creatively around how you craft that narrative. So that's one piece. I think the other piece is finding the common thread. And sometimes, like I said, it's really evident and kind of pops out, but other times it takes a lot of reflection. So to give you an example from my own context, how did I go from mental health of vegetarians to a focus on character-based leadership in med ed? And it took some time to try to figure that out, particularly for my job talk, thinking about how I'm going to, number one, cross disciplines from public health sciences through to health professions education, which are related disciplines but different fields. And then the second, how am I going to tell this story in a way where I can connect these two? And so it took a lot of thought and reflection and conversations with others, but it turned out that I really have an emphasis and a focus and a passion on morals and values. And so morals and values shape how vegetarians, live their lives and the choices they make around what they eat or what they don't eat. And that same set of values, morals, and beliefs can really shape how you engage in a leadership capacity and how you show up for a team and how you interact with healthcare members around you. And so it wasn't self-evident that was my thread early on, but you can sort of craft a narrative around that. I think the biggest piece is also broadening your horizons and really networking, speaking to different people, because sometimes, again, it's not really self-evident what that is. But as you begin to have conversations with people in the field, especially if you're coming from a different discipline, you really get some insight and some experience to how other people are drawing those connections, and that can be a huge help.
In your opinion, which is better, a single research program or a broad program of research?
Well, first thing, I think being more focused is better in the beginning. You can't eat an elephant in one bite. So you take a bite, but you know something about the elephant. I'll give you my example. When I got my first independent faculty position at University of Montreal, I was working. My research program was fairly focused on environmental impacts on male sterility in croplands. But I also knew the context. The context is crop yield. So productivity of a crop depends on the fertility of the male component of the reproductive system, which produces the grains. So you have to know the big picture, but it's best to focus in the beginning, but not focus so narrow. Like male sterility is still a big field. It's got a physiological element, it's got a structural element, it's got a biochemical element, it's got a molecular element to it, and so on. And I was bringing all of those together. But it's narrow enough that you can actually, you have a focus. It's like let's go to a medical equivalent. If I start off my research, say I want to understand human brain, that isn't going to go very far in the beginning, right? Yeah. It probably is not going to go very far even at the end of your career. But if you say I'm working on a certain receptor, but that receptor that does X, Y, and Z, and you know the context, bigger context, but then let's say it's a receptor for smell, right? And you are at least focused to a point where you're trying to understand how brain perceives smell and what impact it has. So I think that's where I would go with it, that be focused, but not so focused that you don't know what's happening in the bigger world, but know your bigger world as well.
Okay. And then from there, so that was the beginning. And would that advice change as you move along in your career?
Yeah, you expand. I think most researchers expand. There are researchers. I know that people who have spent their entire research career on one or two biochemical reactions, and they know everything there is to know about less and less. And that's okay. That's how huge breakthroughs happen. And some things are so complex that people spend all their lives working on a reaction. In my field, for example, there is one enzyme that is the key enzyme in fixing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into carbohydrates in the plants, which is the foundation of all life on Earth. And there are people who have spent their entire career just trying to understand the workings of that enzyme. And I've just recently learned that at MIT, they have improved the efficiency of that enzyme by 25%, which is huge. That's a major, major breakthrough. If it actually works like that, they've done this in the lab, but if they manage to do this in the field, that could translate to a 20 to 25% improvement in yield, which is massive. So there's nothing wrong with focusing on one thing and spending your entire career on it, but normally most people expand their horizon over their career. I was like that. I grew into multiple areas as the time passed. But generally, there are very few people who are like they start as chemists and they become musicians, right? And as in research, there are a lot of chemists who are good musicians. But So you would play generally around the area where you're trained, but that area expands.
And even going back to the PhD or the master's degree, typically when you do a PhD, you're looking at something that is so granular, and then I guess kind of expanding that as you move forward.
Yeah, and by the end of your PhD, you've expanded already. You may not know it, but you actually have. I used to tell it to every PhD student that today you've come to me because you believe that I know more than you do and you have come here to learn something, and that's probably true. But when you finish, if about the subject that you are researching, if you don't know more than me, then I would consider that both of us have failed.
I think that's a really good way to look at it. And I appreciate that because I think a lot of us go into the PhD really feeling like we're not an expert in anything and we don't really know where to go. And part of that PhD is developing that expertise and ultimately growing, not growing past your supervisor per se, but growing with them and understanding that ultimately you're going to develop some deep experience in this field that your supervisor doesn't have.
Yeah. By the time my PhD students graduated, I was learning from them. Yeah.
And that's exactly what you want, I would think.
That's what I miss about being in research, that that interaction with amazingly bright people who are driven.
Which is better, a single research theme or a broad program of research?
Yes.
Okay. Would you like to?
Would I like to expand on that? Yes. But I think they're both important. And it depends what you want. I mean, some people get totally focused, go down a rabbit hole, and are very involved in a small area of research for which they are the world expert. And that's important. We need people to do that. Other people, and I might include some clinician educators in that, are look at things more broadly. They may try to answer research questions which are more applied, or they may be supervising people who are not doing things that are exactly in their bailiwick. So I think they're both important. Then the question comes, important for whom? I suspect that promotions committees look at a program of research and say, oh, yes, they've really been pushing the field in such and such. On the other hand, if you're looking at somebody who is a generalist, as I am, and is able to supervise or do a project or think about a question and then say that needs answering in multiple areas, I think that's important too.
In your opinion, which is better, a single research theme or a broad program of work when starting your career?
I think it really depends on who you are and what kind of orientation you want to have. Some people get into health professions education research because they have a passion on a topic, because there's something that they care about. And in my experience, it's usually that they care about it because they're excited about it, or it's making them quite angry. And in those situations, having a focus is great. But there are other scholars who have methods or theories or a broader array of interests. And so I don't think there's necessarily a better or worse, a right or a wrong. I think it's more about why are you doing this to begin with, and just trying to be honest, true to yourself in that.
What is lost in the other one? So if you choose one or the other, like what are the limitations of one or the other?
Sure. So I think it's often easier to have a single topic as a program of research because it's part of the traditional medical model or the traditional academic model is that you're the expert on topic X. So a lot of the spaces and places where faculty members have to establish themselves as credible, I'm thinking tenure and promotion committees. If you can describe yourself in traditional terms, it's easier for them to say yes to your promotion or those sorts of things. As soon as you're different, it's a little bit harder because you're pushing against norms, pushing against what's expected. But at the same time, quite honestly, I'm a really big fan of pushing against norms. So I feel that we need to teach people to make room for different. So the pro is that you're pushing. The con is you're the spearhead pushing. So, yeah.
Which do you think is more valued by things like tenure committees or granting committees or anywhere where you kind of have to prove or display what your program of research is?
Say the front half again.
Which of these, whether it's a theme.
Yeah. Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
So to finish the question again. Sorry. No, it took me a while to figure out what this was.
Yeah. Sorry. I had to connect. Yeah, that was
okay.
my bad.
No, it's not your bad. It's just me.
So Between the two,
Mhm.
which of the two do you think is more valued by tenure committees, selection committees, granting agencies, anyone else that would need to look at this?
Again, I think most academic institutions, granting agencies, tenure promotion committees, they more readily understand and appreciate a traditional design where you have a topic of interest and you are the world expert on that. Do I think that's right? No. Do I think it's up to the leaders in our community to change those expectations? Absolutely, especially because we're an interdisciplinary field. So the kinds of things that I might be an expert in might not even look like a topic that's worthy of focus for somebody else. So yeah, I think there's work to be done there for sure.
So Maia, what'd you think?
It seems that the answer depends on a person's career stage. So there was some really pragmatic takes. Early in the career, some of our experts thought that it was more important to be narrow and focused, and that later with time, one expands and broadens their program of research. And it was interesting because in listening to those guests, it was as though the effort to be narrow is conscious and concerted, and that the expansion kind of happens naturally or almost like despite yourself, like it's just bound to happen with time. And then other experts were talking about starting broad, and that can also be natural. I think Rob was talking about how he dabbled for 5 to 8 years before finding his lane. And other scholars were speaking about how starting broad can be helpful. The other interesting thing that came up was that perhaps it depends on a person's field. Some fields are the result of a combination of different disciplines. And so in a field like health sciences education, I know Jacqueline, Torti, Linda Snell, Lara Varpio were talking about how one can be broad in one's program in terms of content, perhaps, but then methodologically narrow. And so the question becomes, well, what do we mean by broad?
What do you think about that as someone that's just kind of digging into their research career now at the beginning of their PhD? Where do you see yourself aligning? What felt more resonant to you when you were hearing everybody's answers?
It's interesting because in listening to all the guests' answers, I actually thought of one of our first conversations in which you were telling our class about how you became interested in research and a little bit about your path and what brought you to where you are today and to your program of research. And you told us that your first experience was studying a nematode, C. elegans.
Yes.
I remember.
It was C. elegans. Yes.
So it's funny because my first research experience was in Alexandre Poulin's lab at the University of Ottawa, and I was studying a gene in the environment, organomercury lyase, I think. And here I am today at the Institute of Health Sciences Education. And along the way, I became an intensive care nurse. I was able to do some environmental toxicology with Dr. Naladri Basu at Mac Campus, actually. And so I identified with this non-linear path to research. And finding that narrative, though, that really spoke to me. And it was an exercise that I had to do in applying for funding.
And I think that happens to a lot of us as well, where I started off studying C. elegans, right? I was in the lab every day with my microscope, trying to figure out whether or not they were, what was it called at the time? Hermaphroditic, whether or not they were reproducing, whether or not they went dormant. And then I think about where I am now, where it's I'm doing critical social qualitative research, and that path was all over the place. But when I think about where the scope of that research went, it's tricky. You can still have a narrow focus, but that narrow focus can still be really broad, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that if a focus is, whether your program of research is broad or narrow, finding that narrative, and Meredith said something about kind of being able to make explicit that underlying structure that ties your research together, whether it's a solid foundation of values or some other piece. Perhaps that's easier when one's content focus is narrow, but so it becomes a more difficult exercise when your focus of research is broad. But perhaps as long as that narrative is there, that thread is being able to be weaved through. Okay, I don't like what I'm saying here.
No, but I like your
Yeah.
point. Like, I like your point. It's if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, it's that it doesn't matter if your program of research is narrow or broad. What matters is that you are able to make the narrative of your trajectory explicit to everybody else that is reviewing it. Because what's more important is not whether or not it's narrow or broad, it's whether it's well justified and if the connections are made.
Mm-hmm. The other thing that stood out to me is when looking at building one's research program as a process, it was neat to hear how different researchers described that. And some common elements were that it takes time and it takes conversations and it takes a lot of reflection and thought. And so as a new emerging scholar, that's reassuring to hear. And that it changes. So one can start narrow and broaden, or start broad and then dive deep into one area. And so the alternative ways of thinking of things were new to me, the way Lara Varpio talked about pushing back against norms, and that Jacqueline Torti talked about underlying values and tying in her narrative together.
And with that, Maia, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem. I'm so excited you could join us for the very first episode of Season 3. To everyone else, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for you to see what the rest of Season 3 has in store. So we'll see you for the next episode.
Oh, I'm not a jelly person. I just love peanut butter.
So wait, when you make a peanut butter and something...
I just peanut butter. Peanut butter banana, peanut butter honey, peanut butter banana, peanut butter bacon. Peanut butter and bacon is like the greatest combination.
You are stranded on a small island. Do you think you could survive? And how would you do so?
I would not survive. Likely not.
That's okay. We'll just put this glass in the middle.
No, it's okay. You can't see it. The table.
Something to spill.
Are you ready to get started?
No, you're gonna now I have to get serious.
Now you well, those questions were pretty
Yeah,
serious,
I
but now you have to get like really serious. Okay. Or I can ask you one more silly question.
No. Let's go to serious.
Would you rather have a tree in your back garden that constantly produces every fruit in the world, the best quality and in the best condition, or a trained dinosaur of your choice?
Oh, dinosaur. I don't know what it can do, but I want one.
Like before I even
It doesn't matter.
And cornflakes too. Like I'm not a cornflakes. Okay, let me back this up. And that's the end of this version of Monica's hot takes that she overtook the participant with. So
Yeah.
yeah, she did.
Peanut butter on a hamburger.
That's it.
Ta-da!
We did it.